Good morning, LCC kids. Another Sunday we get to spend together. Thanks so much for tuning in to learn about God's Word. And of course, we're going to start off with today's game. We're playing the game higher or lower. So you're going to be given something that has happened, some fact about, something in the world, maybe a world record. And you have to guess if the number we show you, if the right number is higher than the one that we show you, or lower. So we kind of aiming high, aiming low. Which direction do we have to go? Let's find out with our first one here. All right, the world's longest mustache is 12 feet long. So that's not correct, but the question is, should the real number be higher than 12 feet or lower? So smaller than 12 feet or higher? What do you think? 12 feet would be pretty impressive. I don't know. Let's find out. Higher. The answer is 18 and a half feet long. Could you imagine tripping on that dude's mustache everywhere he went? It's a little gross. All right, let's keep going. Most expensive wedding costs $55 million. My goodness. So, do you think the number should be higher than that or lower than that for the most expensive wedding? You tell us. Well, let's find out. Higher! $66 million. All right, here we go. The longest solo dance marathon lasted 152 hours. So did somebody dance by himself, by herself, without sleeping, they're probably eating and drinking while dancing for 152 hours? Or do you think it's higher than that or lower than that? Who could possibly know? Let's find out. Lower. A little bit lower. 123 hours. That's some sore feet right there. The largest rubber band ball weighs 7,345 pounds. Maybe you've seen a rubber band ball. You put a bunch of rubber bands, one on top of the other, until it forms a ball. The largest one, does it weigh that much? Or maybe a little bit lower, maybe a little bit higher? What do you think? Answer is it's higher. 9,032 pounds. My goodness, that's a pretty big rubber band ball. Now, we see this pattern that happens over and over again in the kings of Israel, where they move higher and they move lower, and they move higher and they move lower. And so we're going to talk about good king and bad king on today's lesson. We found out, we've kind of walked things through all the way to the end of the nation of Israel, which, remember, there were 10 tribes up in the north, and they were called Israel, and they had their own king ever since that bad dude Jeroboam said, hey, we're going to do our own thing now. And Solomon's son Rehoboam was foolish, and he lost, most of the kingdom. But down in the south, where Jerusalem is, all the descendants of David were on the throne, and that was the kingdom of Judah. And, at first, a lot of the kings in Israel, they were just wicked and terrible, and they did all kinds of, terrible things we're not even going to go into today. And it seemed like, the kings in Judah actually weren't much better themselves. Rehoboam was kind of foolish. His son Abijah also led God's people away from him to serve other gods. But then you would have good kings come. So it would, it was like the throne would move higher, the throne would move lower. And so we're going to talk about the cycle that existed of back and forth, good king, bad king. Are we ever going to get out of this mess? So you had some good kings along the way, guys like Asa. He was a good king. Jehoshaphat. Hey, if you're looking for something to name your pet hamster, Jehoshaphat is not a bad name to choose from. You could grab that one. There was a guy named Uzziah who was a pretty good king, did a lot of things right, but ended up dying, doing some not so good things in the end. But all along the way, you see this pattern where, God's people, there's still this, what's called a remnant in the Bible. They're still faithful. They're still following God. But then a bad dude shows up and leads them away. And you had some bad guys, like a guy named Ahaz. This is what Ahaz did. He set up idols all over Jerusalem. He actually shut the doors to the temple. And there's a fancy word for what he did. He desecrated it. He messed it up. He said, hey, we're not going to be worshiping the one true God, Yahweh, anymore. Close the doors. Forget about offering any sacrifices and praise to that. Baal is in the house now. We're following him. And just like that, the people who belong to God went right along with it. Why'd they do that? Well, some of them were probably scared. They're, the king is a powerful man, and so we got to do what he says, and I don't want to get hurt. And, sometimes being afraid of what people think can lead us into some trouble. Maybe some of them liked the power, and they liked the thought of, well, maybe Baal will help us out because he's supposed to make our plants grow and make the water and the rain come down, and I could use a little bit of extra cash and candy. And so following Baal, there are different things that get us into the ditches of idolatry, things like fear and things like, wanting more stuff, wanting to be accepted by other people and wanting them to like us. And pretty soon we have forgotten God. But this guy, Ahaz, he had a son named Hezekiah. And Hezekiah was one of the good kings. He did so many things right. He cleared out the idols of Jerusalem. He opened back up the doors to the temple. He said, hey, we're going to follow God. We're going to set up and actually follow the Passover. Remember the Passover celebration back from Exodus where they had, they put the blood on the doorpost and they shared a meal together and God passed over the firstborn. Every year since then, Israel was supposed to follow the Passover, remembering God's redeemed us. God rescues us. And they totally stopped doing any of that stuff. So Hezekiah said, we're going to bring back Passover. And there's a lot that he did right. But then he had a son named Amon. And Amon put it all back. Everything that Hezekiah put down, his son came along and said, nope, we're worshiping Baal again. We're closing the temple doors. We're setting up all the idols. How are we ever going to get out of this mess? It seems like even with the good guys, and Hezekiah had some issues too toward the end of his life. He was a little prideful. Even the good guys aren't good enough to fix God's people. Where does it end? Well, we'll find out in just a moment. But let's jump back into our higher and lower game and see about some of these facts. All right, the most tricks done by a dog in 1 minute is 36. Most tricks done by my dog in 1 minute is 0. But let's see. This seems like a very, friendly, fun dog. 49 tricks in a minute. I don't know what counts as a trick for a dog, but let's keep going. The highest jump by a llama is 2 feet, 3 inches. I don't know how they have that on record, but do you think that number should be higher or lower? I've got no reference point for llama jumps, so let's just find out. Higher, it should be 3 feet, 8 inches. All right. The most expensive grilled cheese sandwich sold regularly at a restaurant costs $135. My friends, if you're out there buying $135 grilled cheese sandwiches, please just stop. Please get some help. But do you think that number should be higher or lower? It's actually higher, $214. Make yourself grilled cheese for lunch. The most people riding on a surfboard at one time, 75. There's no way. What size surfboard are we talking about here? Well, let's see. It's a little bit lower, but not much. 66 people on that surfboard. All right. Last one. The longest time balancing a chainsaw on the chin, I'm guessing while it's running, is 9.32 minutes. Now, what happens at 9.33 minutes to that chainsaw when it's no longer balancing on your chin? I don't want to have to think about that, but let's see if you can think about whether or not this is the right answer. It's much lower than that. Just about a minute and a half or so. Maybe we can find footage of that later on. All right, back to our story. What's going to break the cycle of the good king and the bad king, and the good kings not being good enough and the bad kings being terrible? Well, right around this time, in the nation of Judah, rises up a prophet. In fact, he first got his call from God in the year when King Uzziah died. We mentioned Uzziah earlier. And Isaiah, a guy named Isaiah, is called to be a prophet from God. And he started calling for God's people. Hey, we got to go back to God. We got to stop with this idol silliness. Like y'all are worshiping blocks of wood. You cut it in half and you take half of it and you make a fire and you cook breakfast, and you take the other half and you bow down and say, "Oh, holy idol, thank you for creating me. What are you doing?" So, he's getting in the face of God's people in a way that's loving, because we need to realize, hey, idols are dumb. Why do we worship them? But not only did he say that, he said there's coming a king from Judah. It's like, think of like if the nation of Judah had been cut off and it just was a tree stump, nothing there, nothing growing. He said there's going to be this little shoot, this new growth that's going to come out of that stump, a shoot of Jesse, and he's going to be a righteous king, and he's going to lead the people into righteousness and restoration, and ultimately bring everything become new. Who's he talking about there? Well, you know who we're talking about. We're talking about King Jesus. King Jesus, a descendant of David, from the tribe of Judah, from the nation of Judah. He came to claim the rightful throne. He wasn't a king like anybody expected, but he was the one who could break the cycle. He didn't just, fix up the temple like Hezekiah did, although he did cleanse out the temple when he was in his earthly ministry. But he came and he was the final sacrifice to bring us to God and to heal our hearts that so quickly turn away from him. So let's look to Jesus. Let's not, because of fear or wanting to be cool or wanting to have power, form idols that aren't of God. But let's trust King Jesus to lead us in the way of God's righteousness. And we'll find out, hey, what happened in the story of Judah next week. See you next Sunday, kids.